Hey everyone, this is Craig. Every now and then, those of us at Acid Horizon need a bit of a break from producing our regular podcast series. So this week, we decided to bring everyone behind the veil to enjoy an episode made available exclusively to our Patreon subscribers. This is the full discussion of George Bataille's Guilty with our friend and colleague Stuart Kendall, whom, as many of you already know, delivered to us an excellent 4-week primer on the work of Bataille. And if you haven't afforded yourselves a few hours to spend time with Stuart's erudite reading of Bataille and his extremely clear presentation of the themes familiar to Bataille's work, I don't know what else to say. You should treat yourself to those lectures soon. If you have already subscribed to the Acid Horizon Research Commons course archive, of course, thank you. But if you just want to take a peek at what we've got going on, and you're already a patron of the podcast, or if you'd like to be, every month we offer free 1-month subscriptions to the course archive as a courtesy to those who support us and for those who aren't in a position to support more financially. Among the many things that we're trying to do with our para-academic program is to make the work of the collective eminently accessible while hosting classes that pay our instructors well for their time and contribution to our project. It's something that we are still building, and we just want to thank everyone who has recognized our vision and supported us accordingly. Anyway, drop down into the show notes to find all of the links to the AHRC and our summer classes, which just kicked off, and you still have time to enroll, so don't wait. In the meantime, let's welcome back Stuart Kendall to the podcast as we rediscover George Bataille's Guilty. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. It is no secret that over the past few years, we have been slowly building up a shared discourse around the work of George Bataille, interrogating many of his key concepts: excess, sovereignty, eroticism, transgression, and more. This trajectory had no clear point of origin, yet along the way, there have been certain standout engagements that, in retrospect, reveal something like an informal apprenticeship in Bataille's philosophy and writing. Stuart Kendall, who joins us today and whose work has been one of the resources we've returned to repeatedly throughout that journey, is very much part of that story. Those encounters ultimately culminated in our project, Acéphalous, the erotic tarot of George Bataille, which was released last year and whose supply is, well, just about exhausted. That is until today, or tonight rather, because today marks another moment in the unfolding of that project. Not only are we celebrating the release of the Acéphalous Compendium, the hardbound volume associated with the tarot deck, but we are also less than a week away from introducing Stuart to many of our listeners, followers, comrades, and fellow seekers in a new context through the Acid Horizon Research Commons. Beginning next week, Stuart will lead Formless, George Bataille, and the Three Ecologies. And if you're not yet among those enrolled, there is still time to join. You'll find information about that in the show notes. If you are listening to this discussion in March of 2026, that means you are either a patron of the podcast or someone who is already enrolled in the class. So thank you for supporting us and helping make these conversations possible. But today we're excited to discuss what we might call a prelude to that course, while also celebrating Stuart's contribution to the compendium. In particular, we'll be discussing the essay that appears in the compendium, The Exacerbation of Instabilities, a piece that explores Bataille's fascination with moments of rupture and those privileged instants where history, catastrophe, experience, and thought collide. Stuart, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me back. It's great to be here.
So let's talk about this essay. And as you said just before we started recording here today, that this particular essay actually is a nice sort of entry point into the work of Bataille. And as I imagine it, there's going to be a few people in the class for whom this will be the first sustained engagement that they have with Bataille's work. This essay circles around a tension that seems central to his work, a kind of pull between historical understanding and what you have termed in the essay, the privileged instant. Could you start off by explaining what drew you particularly to that tension as a topic for the essay?
Yes, I should say, so the essay is, it's a few pages, and it touches on many themes and topics, and it stretches from sort of Bataille's early work to The Tears of Ross, his last book. But it really focuses in on some pages from Guilty, which I find, Guilty, to me, I go back to Guilty again and again because it's so rich in ideas and I should also say problems. Just what is going on in this crazy book? Why does he reference certain things? What's hidden behind the text? All that kind of stuff. And so that animates me and motivates me as a translator to spend time on the book, but also as a critic and reader engaged with Bataille. And so, ruminating on these pages early in Guilty, it's almost endlessly fascinating to me. But Bataille in Guilty is writing about the events of his day, some of the most momentous events in the 20th century, the beginning of World War II. But he also doesn't want to talk about it. He says that he's taking war on as a theme of meditation, and that means that war and all war. But that's not why he's writing. So why is he writing? And what is he writing about? And how is his writing related to time, to history? And so this kind of question, how is his writing related to the events of his day as a vehicle for thought? Just trying to follow his thought churning there. That's the point of this essay, to see what he's doing. And as I looked into that, I recognized the fact that Bataille's writing touches on, as we know, myriad styles, right? He writes in a plurality of styles. And a lot of these styles of writing, these forms of writing, let's say genre of writing, they each have different relationships to the problem of time, of temporality. So at certain points, like in Guilty and on Nietzsche, he's writing in a diaristic form. At other points in the 1930s, he's writing a political diary. So it's like writing very much about the moments of the day. At other points, he writes as a journalist, though he didn't really publish that. He was like, I need to record what's happening now. And at other points, he writes as a political provocateur, responding to, trying to edge history on, if we want to put it quite like that. And yet at other points, he's trying to write with the objectivity of a scholar. So Bataille's writing spans these different types of very subjective writing and these very objective types of writing. And it's, what's that oscillation about? I mean, I think particularly for readers of Bataille, often in English, we stick with our preferred genre, So readers might be drawn to his fiction or his poetry, or they might be drawn to his, let's say, anthropology, his sociology. They might be drawn to his philosophy, and that might have something to do with their own predilections and interests. But Bataille didn't write and think like that. He migrated across disciplines and across genre of writing, across styles of writing for different ends. He used them for different purposes, often related to these problems of history. And we should say that this was a problem for him, right? Bataille is a problematic writer, and that includes for himself. He talks about writing The Accursed Chair and how it took him 18 years to do it. He had an idea, but he couldn't find the form or the genre for that writing. How do you say it? So as the 1930s progress, he's looking for the form for The Accursed Chair, and it takes him, it took 18 years. It took him another decade. I'm thinking of from the late 1930s to the late 1940s. And he crosses all these other pathways too. But again, what does that do for us? Like, what should we, as readers of Bataille, bring to the table? Should we stick within our lanes, read just his philosophy if we're philosophers, just his fiction if we love fiction? Or should we try to see how he's using these things, sort of one against the other? And another element to this, of course, is that Bataille writes with reference to other people, right? He says that a thought is a brick in a wall, and we need to see the other bricks. So we need to see the other thoughts upon which it's built, that wall is built, or with which it's built. So he writes with reference. Sometimes that reference is overt, sometimes it is covert or esoteric. So tracing his use of thought, his use of the thought of others, is another part of this. How is he using other people's thoughts And so those are some of the things that I'm trying to tease out in this short piece.
Everything that you're saying about Bataille right now is one of the reasons I keep him as a kind of intellectual anchor, even though I wouldn't consider him as my absolute favorite thinker. I think he is still an avatar of that deep impulse that many of us share, that we want to traverse these different domains of writing and creativity. And he does so with such a strong self-awareness of that. And one of the questions that came up for me this time around, and I want to say that in reading this essay, I learned something new about Bataille, or had a new insight about him anyway. And I was just, and we'll get to what that insight is in just a bit. But do you think that at any given point, we have Bataille the historian looking backward, the journalist in the present, the revolutionary anticipating the future, and then this other sort of like the shell of objectivity that surrounds all of that? Once he acknowledged that as being the sort of multifaceted modalities within which he worked, did he make that a kind of a theoretical or rhetorical object in his own universe? Was he self-aware to that extent?
He absolutely was. And we can see this in the post-war writings in particular. I think for Bataille in his early work, it's there too. It's perhaps even more radicalized because he publishes the writings of a responsible historian in the 1920s, but he also writes something like Story of the Eye. So it's completely radical at that point. But then he struggles with this sort of duality and this multiplicity of styles throughout the 1930s as he writes that densely metaphoric prose that we see, particularly in the essays he published in Verve, or in things like the Obelisk or the Labyrinth, stuff like that, where it's just like, what's going on here? So dense with metaphor that it's almost illegible at times. So he really struggles with that. And even in the mid-1940s, as he's writing some of his greatest works, like Guilty and On Nietzsche, he says explicitly in On Nietzsche that he wants to write in a more legible style. He wants to be more clear. He's very concerned with this. And yet he still writes in this multiplicity of genres. So I talk about this a little bit in the preface to, or my introduction to, the Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge, right? The collection of the rest of Bataille's aphoristic writings. So what he did with those pieces is he published them in different kinds of journals. He had Critique, where he wrote his, let's call it criticism, so more objective, more responsible, more scholarly. And then he had a range of other writings that he published in Boîte Obscure or Troisième Convoi, or other places like this that are proto-surrealist, post-surrealism already by the 1950s, but there are these other types of journals. And so, I often think of this in the same way that Foucault talks about some of his books being experience books and other books being of a different sort. Bataille has that same division in his post-war writings where it's more of an experience piece. And that would be one of the things that ends up in the Unfinished System of Non-Knowledge, as opposed to the collection of critical essays. That's somewhat obscured in the collections of critical essays that have come out through Seagull, which I'm really glad to have. But editorially, we don't quite see what holds them together in that way. So there's things to say about that. But it's a very conscious thing that Bataille is doing. He's writing for different audiences in different ways to communicate and to try things out. And we should also say that Bataille, he's a great user of drafts. He writes for certain venues, and then he's going to rewrite that essay. For example, the Accursed Chair is entirely made up of essays previously published in Critique or other journals. So he writes it for a certain type of journal, he rewrites it to create a book. And that too is an important part of this. He wants to communicate, he wants to be clear, but he also wants to have an experience of writing. in different moments.
When you were talking about how Bataille was aiming to be more clear, I can't help but think about exactly in these unfinished system of non-knowledge, the interaction he has. He's one of the first people to really interact with English analytic philosophy. Yeah. Not because he necessarily picks it up, because he has this sort of conversation with A.J. Ayer. And I can imagine that would have had quite an impact of like, how the hell is this guy managed to be like so commonsensical about it, or at least talk as if he's doing it very commonsensically. I don't know if he read, Language, Truth and Logic. And I think you really bring up quite a powerful thing in terms of Bataille's, essentially his quest to work out how the hell you write anything at the time of which he's writing. Because he starts off with this, well, not starts off, but, in the 30s and just before the war, he's in this sort of very Hegelian mode. He's working with, he's going to lectures of Alexandre Kojève, and he's thinking, well, if Hegel has sorted this out, then what is my role here? I'm this unemployed negativity. And then, luckily and unluckily for him, history starts again. And I've always, the thread that I always bring to Bataille, at least I hope I'm not projecting, is that there's something to me that's unifying in him. It is a kind of, or not unifying, it's this trajectory from excitement to horror. And I think your essay, particularly when we're talking about stuff like Blue of Noon and Guilty, really picks up that thread in which he goes, he's interrogating his relationship to the concept of war. He's reading stuff like Ernst Junger and thinking, this could be the basis of the accursed share. Yeah. And then I sometimes wonder if, the guiltiness is in a way sort of partially his, maybe in a sense, his guilt for being so enthusiastic about the concept of war. That's just my reading to the extent that he never publishes Blue of Noon because he's sort of like, okay, it was pointless. There's this sort of like weird shift in his thinking where he becomes like more horrified at the idea of war, and he sort of, he takes the Junger out of the limit of the useful when it eventually turns into the accursed share. And I have to wonder, when it comes to this idea of Bataille's writing, how do we think about it in terms of, is it, you say it's accurate at all to describe it in terms of the horror of history going on at that point, particularly this horror around war, and what it would mean to write philosophy at a time which all of this stuff is going? You'd have to focus on the moment because everything else is spiraling out of control.
Well, that is an option. And, certainly. Yeah. So I call this essay The Exacerbation of Instabilities, a phrase from Bataille, because what he's trying to do in a lot of this writing is provoke an experience for himself. But that's not the only experience. And we'll probably want to circle back to this idea a little bit later, but, it's core to Bataille's thinking that we need both types of thought. We need to have a search, we need rational, orderly planning. We need to be able to plan for the future, but we also need an escape from that plan. We need a way to abandon ourselves to the moment. And it's that tension that he's constantly, or what's the right metaphor for this? It's the boat he's constantly rocking. It's the thing that he might cover over the horror, but then he pokes, he sticks his finger in it again. And that it's that exacerbation of instability that he's constantly working with. But one of the things that you're talking about there is, or rather, sort of behind one of the things that you're talking about there is some of the ways that the ironies of history play out across his corpus, right? He writes Blue of Noon trying to figure out what is happening. He calls the book, or a chapter of the book, Evil Omens. He's really trying to find the future. And I have another essay on this work, but I read that book as a farce in which he stuffed everything from the present into it, hoping to find the future as the way out. That's an idea that comes from Norman O'Brown, reading Finnegan's Wake. If we can take everything from the future, or from the present, we can find the future. And that's what we have in Blue of Noon in 1935. And Bataille tries to publish it, but, André Malraux says no. And, for Gallimard. And so events march on. Then of course Bataille takes two sections of that and publishes them, or one section of that draft, and it includes it in Inner Experience. So it's this use of the same material in different contexts and different forms that kind of keeps coming back as a refrain. But now we just sort of read it as a novel, as though it was just a novel. It came out in 1957. It's a novel, but in fact it has a very troubled history as a book. Similarly, just his concept of war it's easy enough to read Bataille sort of out of context and see his valorization of war. In the late 1930s, in the context of Acéphalous, he says that war, quoting Nietzsche, is the great stimulus to the imagination. That war, then in the early part of the war, even in Guilty on page 10, he says that he's going to meditate on war. So he's still taking war as a stimulus to the imagination, and this is the point when he's reading Junger, right? War as inner experience, which in French is translated at that time. The 1934 translation of the book was War, Our Mother. That's what Bataille read. So that's a very interesting way. He's got an essay on the tragic mother in the late 1930s. It's war, the mother. There's a lot to say about this in Bataille. I'll skip over that. But, it's war as stimulus to the imagination. War as inner experience in Junger, which is what Bataille is trying to do in the Limits of Utility draft. But then his attitude towards war changes. He lives through war. His post-war attitude towards war is completely different. In the post-war period, he wants to avoid war. War is terrible. And he also, in the later writings, in Tears of Eros, observes that war has become, and his phrases here are anticipatory of Baudrillard's take on war. War has become a disciplinary action. It is organized war. It is objective war. It's distanced war. It's a war that is happening out there, but it's not affecting us in here. So Bataille's attitude towards war, it evolves. It changes in response to the stimuli of the present. And yet, those things are they're related. They spin around one another. When he says that war is a disciplinary action, orderly, he's disappointed. That is a problem. Auschwitz and Hiroshima, man-made mass death, are bad things. And they're partly bad because we don't feel them, because they're not a place for our passions. What we need is still a place for our passion. We need a place to let our energy out. And that's what Bataille's corpus is about, is balancing this orderliness and passion. War without passion is a horror of a different kind.
I want to flag something that maybe we can talk about at the end of the discussion, which is the relationship that Bataille had with his father and mother. Since you brought up war as a mother, I know that in the Surya biography, that's covered fairly extensively. For the time being, I want to go back to the essay here and stick to this concept of the privileged instant. And, I'm very glad that I actually wrote another essay for the Acéphalous Compendium that does not appear there, where I actually use Kierkegaard's concept of anxiety. And I did not know that Bataille had read that. And so having not known that, I would have shown my ass to every other Bataille scholar. So thankfully, I wrote about something else, and I have the humility to say that. But I'd like to interrogate this concept, because before hearing you enunciate this term, and this concept of privileged instant comes from a French mystic, as I understand it. I used to call Bataille's orientation towards time a kind of radical presentism. And a privileged instant could be that. Let's unpack that term and Bataille's general ontology of time and how it pertains to this mysticism. And do you see Bataille as participating in a mystical tradition of some sort as a result?
There's lots to say here, right? So this term privileged instant comes from his essay, The Sacred, which he published in 1939. But he was importantly writing that in November of 1938, while Colette Pénaud-Laure was in the next room dying. So he's sitting there trying to write about the sacred and what he thinks of as this quest for communication, what she thinks of also as a quest for communication at this moment of death. So enormously loaded moment in their lives and in her death that's gathered in this essay. In the essay, thinking about what the sacred is, he has these things to say about communication, but as he's talking about it, he's trying to be more precise. What is this experience of the sacred? And he uses this phrase, a privileged instance, that's from Emile Durmengen, who is a he's writing about Sufism. So he's not a mystic himself. He's a Dermington. He's a guy writing about Sufism. And he uses this phrase, privileged instant, to think about an instant that tears the roots, there's the quote, tears the roots of the past and the future away from the instant. So it's not part of history anymore. Now, Bataille is quoting this from the journal Mesure, which was edited by Henri Michaud and Jean Paulin. And so it's interesting where Bataille gets this term, at least to me. Also where he publishes this remark. He publishes in Cahiers d'Art in this special issue about the sacred. So it's not a pure, sort of history of religion thing. It's a thing that's part of a journal of poetry, the Mesure article. And then it's a thing that's published in an art journal, which explains the images that accompany it, which we can see in Visions of Excess. So it's already this kind of interdisciplinary hybrid space of origin and outcome. But this thinking about the instant, this thinking about the moment, is obviously very important. And Bataille's thinking about it not just through this notion of privileged instance, but he's searching around for other language and other ways of conceptualizing it, which includes, of course, Soren Kierkegaard. Now, we mentioned a few minutes ago, Adam did, the idea that Bataille was attending the courses, the lectures of Alexander Kojev on Hegel's phenomenology. So this is a philosophy of history, but we know that, this is very important for Bataille's formation and his thought. But he also takes Hegel to be the great enemy. Hegel is both true and wrong. And so how do we deal with that? And what are the resources that we have to combat that? Now, also in the 1930s, Kierkegaard is being translated for the first time into French. So Kojev is important because there was no translation of Hegel, of the phenomenology at that time. Kojev is translating it out loud to people. And they don't, Bataille could read German, but he didn't at that moment. It was Kojev's interpretation that was much more important. Similarly with Kierkegaard, Bataille can't read Danish. So he's going to start to read these translations of Kierkegaard, but he's also going to read essays about Kierkegaard, particularly by his friend Jean Wahl. So Jean Wahl becomes the interpreter of Kierkegaard for the French in the same way that Kojev is the interpreter of Hegel. And we can read those essays by Wahl and the things that he focuses on in Kierkegaard as like a way of helping understand the what's going on. So in this moment, we see Bataille on his own reading Nietzsche as a way through, but he also reaches out to Kierkegaard as a way to combat Hegel, which makes sense and which we all do. So as you mentioned, Craig, the notion that the concept of anxiety, which is Kierkegaard's major statement on what the instant is and how it relates to history, is a book that Bataille read in 1937, so right at the beginning of the Acéphalous adventure. And then he reread it, and this is even more important. He reread it in the fall of 1941, right before he writes Inner Experience. So it's a crucial book for him in terms of reorienting his thought. And reorienting his thought not only about the instant, but also about sin. So the concept of anxiety is also about sin. It's about history. It's about original sin. And all these things are churning around in the pages of Guilty. So when we read those first pages of Guilty, we see Bataille ruminating on war, ruminating on Hegel, ruminating with Nietzsche, and in the background, Kierkegaard, thinking about the instant and the problem of sin, which is why the discussion on sin, which happens the following year, after Guilty is published in 1944, the discussion on sin happens. So why is it about sin? Kierkegaard is the answer to that. And we see that already in the pages of Guilty, which is this great churning notebook. It's like a workbook of Bataille's thoughts where we can see him kind of moving from from problem to problem as he's recording the events of the day. It's really an extraordinary kind of production. But basically what we have in those first pages of Guilty is Bataille thinking about war, thinking about history, about Hegel, and countering that with Nietzsche and then Kierkegaard's thought of the instant.
How then would we visualize, for lack of a better term, the ontology of time that he has in mind with respect to the present? It's not your sort of garden variety, live, laugh, love, be here now sort of understanding of time. It's almost as if it's a contraction of the past and the future upon the present in a way. And how does Bataille, in any sense, believe that delivers us from suffering or forces us to enter more deeply into it, or is redemptive in any way? What does he intend to do with that thought?
With time, with his thought about time?
Yes.
Well, for Bataille, as he says in his essay Sacrifices, time is best understood as a catastrophe. Time is rupture and disruption. So if Hegel takes that the problem of time and turns it into the unfolding of meaning that culminates with the end of history, Bataille says no. The moments of time are moments of rupture and discontinuity. So while time may march forward with history, there will be this constant disruption and separation, which is our individual lives. And we can't make sense out of those individual moments. They are not part of the sense of history. This is wherein we don't know, the meaning of our moments eludes us. And that's something that Bataille revels in. But this, of course, where he turns to Nietzsche in Guilty. And that's a really important moment in the book, and also immensely fascinating to me. It's this guy, Bataille, who spent the late 1930s reading and rereading Nietzsche's works, referencing Nietzsche constantly. There he is sitting there ruminating on time, and he quotes Gay Science 287, which is this. So Nietzsche, The Joyful Science. Pleasure in blindness. My thoughts, said the wanderer to his shadow, should show me where I stand, but they shouldn't reveal to me where I'm going. I love my ignorance of the future, and I don't want to perish of impatience and tasting in advance things that are promised. So this is Nietzsche. It fascinates me that, out of all that reading, Bataille singles out this passage. It's like all the Nietzsche that you spent time with, and this is the one? This is the one that you're going to over and over again mull and come back to and turn into a talisman? But it is. So my thoughts should show me where I stand, as Nietzsche says, or, the wanderer says to his shadow. And what that means in the context of the joyful science is that I should use thinking to tell me where I am, to tell me what has come before, and to help me understand that. They shouldn't, Nietzsche continues, show me where I'm going. In other words, don't project, don't anticipate. So think about book 4 of The Joyful Science. This is where 287 occurs. This is the book in which the book begins with Nietzsche's evocation of, amour fati, the love of fate. And it ends, of course, that book, with the evocation of the eternal return. So Nietzsche, in book 4 of The Joyful Science, is thinking about time in a completely different way, we should say, than Bataille is. He's thinking about the love of fate. Bataille will transform that into the love of chance. He's thinking about the eternal return, which Bataille, in other writings, dismisses completely, saying that it's utterly useless. But in the middle of that book, he has this passage, which Bataille seizes upon this small fragment of it. That second sentence, I love my ignorance of the future, and I don't want to perish of impatience and tasting things that are promised. So Nietzsche is saying, I don't want to anticipate. I don't want to read the future. Bataille focuses in, and he quotes, I love my ignorance of the future. That ignorance is what Bataille uses to to disrupt Hegelian certainties. The Hegelian certainty that leads to the idea of the end of history, the completion of knowledge. Bataille uses this "I love ignorance" thing to dwell in that. He layers it on the Kierkegaardian instant, saying, I don't want to know. I want to not know. And in this passage of Guilty, you can see Bataille pull this quote from Nietzsche as a counter to Hegel. And it's the beginning of his thought of what we call, non-knowledge, non-savoir, of not knowing. Nietzsche says, I love my ignorance toward the future. And Bataille dwells on the not knowing, which, of course, there's some translation elements to this as a problem. What's the relationship between ignorance and not knowing? How do we translate that? But for Bataille, that's the thing. I love my ignorance toward the future. He writes in the Notebooks of Guilty. So he's writing this in September of 1939, and it will remain unpublished. He dwells on this not knowing, and it becomes the quest for, non-savoir, which is, of course, something that he explores throughout inner experience. We have in these pages the beginning of the turn towards thinking about inner experience. But he hasn't had any of those thoughts yet when Bataille writes this. So he starts, I don't want to know the future. It's the war. I'm okay not knowing the outcome of war. And then he dwells, it's like focusing in. He dwells on not knowing. So another thing, sort of a ramification of this thought is that, when we think about non-savoir, or when I do, for years I thought non-savoir, of course, he's reading emphatic theology. This is negative theology. And it's very easy to read it as negative theology, as though he'd read the, divine names and said, we don't know God. But it doesn't come from that. He goes to the divine names because of this ignorance. The ignorance comes from Nietzsche, from not knowing the future. And then he has to think about the implications of not knowing. And this leads him to read those theologians. And we can see that in his, the books that he borrowed from the Bibliothèque Nationale. But it's all right there in Guilty as a workshop of thought.
Oh, Adam, before you go, let me get this quote in because I know it's going to dovetail right into what you're going to ask about. So in your translation of Guilty, which I will say to all the listeners right now, for some reason, I didn't have Stuart's translation. I had the other translation. I got the new translation. It was way better. What was I doing? And then, Stuart, you pointed us to pages 20 to 23 in preparation to read this particular essay, if I'm not mistaken. So I think the section is entitled Angel, if I'm not mistaken. There is a quote in here that's so badass, I need to read it out loud, okay? And let's begin. So Bataille writes, there's the universe. In the middle of its night, man discovers its parts and discovers himself. But this discovery is always unfinished. When he dies, a man leaves survivors condemned to destroy what he believed, to profane what he venerated. Holy fuck, that is such a badass line. Adam, when I die, call my wife and tell her to put that on the tombstone. But wait, it's not done. He writes, I understand that the universe is this way, but certainly those who follow me will see my errors. Human science should be grounded on its completion. Being incomplete, it is not science. It is only the inevitable, dizzying product of the will to science. So I know this is going to get us into the Hegelian territory and probably what Adam's going to ask about next, but sorry, Adam, I cut you off.
I wasn't about to go into Hegel mode. If anything, in that passage, Bataille is clearly a Kantian in line with the first critique. But other than that, the asymptotic nature of scientific completeness. But I just wanted to, just unpack some of the stuff, just what you're talking about regarding this instant in terms of ignorance of the future, because fundamentally, I think one of the Nietzschean aspects of it is it's insecure. It is unstable. Yeah. And there's something there where Bataille wants to meditate on this insecurity that only relates to, the idea of war as disciplinary, as, trying to secure. I mean, that the Nazis are trying to secure the next 1,000 years in that context. They are very much subverting the present to the future. And I just wanted to ask, how Bataille would like to meditate on that instability, and to what extent is this idea of instability and insecurity essentially becoming like a new kind of maybe value, where one can sort of inherit that instability, that insecurity, without therefore trying to to override the whole world? Is he trying to sort of bring in maybe some sort of a value of insecurity to the way that we might practice philosophy or writing or even society itself? Because like he's seen that this complete subordination of everything to, securing everything, locking everything down,
right,
is exactly the sort of thing that's causing us to destroy ourselves.
Exactly. That is the problem. Our quest for order and control. We need to follow a leader who's going to promise to secure our borders, and things like that. And Bataille is saying, no, what we need to do is let go of that will to control, that will to mastery. We need to let ourselves go, and we need to let go of that will to mastery. So he's very much responding to that as a problem, this quest for order. But again, as I said, and as he says a few pages after this in Guilty, we need order. Human beings, human civilization depends upon order. We can only exist within a certain range of temperatures. We need food every certain, number of hours. We need a certain amount of orderliness. So what we need to do is find the right balance of order and disorder so that we can have the joy of disorder along with the certainty of order. And exploring the nature of that joy, the extent of that joy. So, some people love to read Bataille because of his evocation of excess, and I do, and intoxication, self-loss, and that's all in Bataille. But Bataille also always insists that we can only have that excess if we have, the sort of the norm, the regular as well. So finding the right, the right opportunity for passion, the right time and place for it, the right extent of it. And it involves self-loss and uncertainty and instability. And so what is the extent of our, just how much uncertainty can we tolerate? That is, of course, the mark. And as you suggested briefly, there are enormous implications of this for, let's say, the practice of philosophy. If philosophy is all about ordered thoughts, clear and distinct ordered thoughts, then Bataille is not a philosopher. What he's preaching is the opposite of philosophy. And here I'm thinking also of Jean-Paul Sartre's critique of Bataille, who's basically saying you're not a philosopher. And I love the beginning of Bataille's response to Sartre when he says that his is the first paragraph of Bataille's response to Sartre. He says, "For slow readers, my book moves too fast and has too many moods and too many things." It's just so rude, but it's true. Bataille oscillates. He's all over the place, and that's not philosophy. It is not orderly thought. He's not bringing order to thought. And if we want to bring order to Bataille's thought, then we are of necessity betraying his thought. So how much order can we bring to Bataille's thought? And then how much, how can we have the appropriate disorder to our readings of Bataille? But I want to go back to that quote that you started with, before the Hegel stuff, about the notion of the disciples and being betrayed. This is very important. Obviously, he's thinking possibly of I think about Zarathustra saying, "I don't want disciples." That's a thing that Bataille would be familiar with. But he wrote that sentence in September of 1939, and around October 20th of 1939, according to Patrick Waldberg, Bataille asked the remaining members of Acéphalous to kill him. So he wrote that sentence, not just thinking, and this is, I think Waldberg is telling the truth. I think that did happen. I think that Bataille was writing those first pages of Guilty, anticipating asking the members of Acéphalous to kill him, that they are in a way, a confession. They're the end of his thought. They are telling the story of writing the sacred. He says this on page 178 of my edition. He says that he wanted to get to this point where he evokes the writing of the sacred. And if we read up to that moment, it's all, I think, setting the stage for, as he says, a new mode of crucifixion. That's his phrase. Wherein the members of Acéphale will kill their leader. So having the courage to kill your leader, that is what Acéphale is about. Having the courage to let yourself go as a leader, not to cling to power, but to let yourself go. That's true courage as a leader. That's true power. The power to let it all go.
Hot damn.
I'm going to sample that in a black metal song. Sorry, Stuart. That was fantastic. I don't even, I can't understand that follows that. I mean, I've just been completely, yeah. If Decibel Omega take this, I swear to God, if you're listening to Decibel Omega, no, I claimed it first. Oh God, what?
Was that the...
I mean,
can we not continue after that?
No, yes, we can. Cause it's specifically about something about the class, actually, is, or at least some of the discussions you've especially to the show before, is that I quite like this affirmation of instability, because one of the things that security, order and security in this pure order doesn't give us, is exactly the thing that you've been focusing on your recent one, Bataille, which is it's not sustainable. Yeah. It's not reproducible. And security actually is fundamentally it's not to be too dialectical about it, but there's nothing more insecure than security, and there's nothing more unsustainable security. And I think this is a really good way of thinking about like how Bataille's relation to time is also all about, I mean, I was about to say he's an early social reproduction theorist, but from in a very masculinist lens, which does need to be, let's say, extended quite a bit. But there is this aspect there of focusing so much on reproduction that he does end up bringing in this aspect of sustainability. I was wondering if you can expand on that, where you think this. Do you think this exacerbation of instability is actually at the root of thinking of Bataille as a thinker of sustainability as opposed to security?
I absolutely do. I think it's utterly crucial to thinking about that. So the typical discourse of sustainability, sort of too often focuses naively on eco-efficiency and rational outcomes. Just like rationalize everything. And of course, that's important. If we don't do that, we're dead. But finding the right place for joy, the right place for the joy of wasting, that's the core of Bataille's message. So this means the time to live in the moment and not think about the future. Sustainability is like, well, sustainability is boring because it's in the future. But it's not. It's also about now. What are we doing now? So that, this kind of oscillation, that's part of what Bataille is thinking about. It's also about the way that our political systems and social interactions. Where's the fun in it? We need the festival. But if life becomes too much of a festival, then we have too much instability. So we're caught in this oscillation in pretty much every area of our lives between boredom and anxiety. But we need that. We need these places for outcome. The time when we can live in the present and not worry about the sustainability for the future, where we don't have to think about recycling, and being responsible. Responsibility is boring, so we need a day of the week when we're irresponsible, or whatever it is. We need a time and a place, a space where we can have our excesses. And until we find the way that works, we will not have a workable model of sustainable thinking. So yeah.
This is how I like to think about when Bataille talks about hypermorality. It's like it's a morality that can only exist insofar as it acknowledges its own complicity with evil. Sometimes I think about that as sort of a system of values that can, or at least the idea of a system of values that can essentially maintain itself in this instability without becoming this infinite task of ultimately translating the world into the rational. And to that extent, he's an anti-Kantian, so I redeem myself from at least he's most first critique, doesn't get into the second. Thank God for that.
Oh, no,
but
that's
Craig,
fine.
sorry, I've been talking quite a bit.
Well, then my question would be for those of us who've read Bataille in a more extreme fashion, erring on the side of the festival, this pivot back towards rationality, towards order, towards a kind of equilibrium or balance. Clearly, one of the risks is falling back into a form of governmentality or authority that's just going to recapitulate the very thing that we're fighting against. What do you see? I mean, Adam has brought up one thing with hypermorality, but is there something, a kernel within Bataille's work that acts as a fail-safe of sorts to prevent that possibility? Or is there a maxim that's operative within his work that will ensure that we don't go down the path of Hitler or Trump or whoever?
Yeah. So Bataille is ultimately attempting to come up with a morality, as he says, morality of evil in the post-war period. He wants a system of morality, but that's a morality of evil that acknowledges the importance of transgression. And in that tragic sense of morals, here's the rub. It ends up sounding a lot like Camus, right? Because it's the tragedy will set its own balances. That once we engage in these things, we will encounter our own limits. And he talks about this at various points. We can only go so far as individuals before our body gives out, this kind of thing. So it's in that type of what I want to say, limitation that, I think Bataille finds a level setting. But of course, what we have right now is people with almost infinite power that are utterly disconnected from reality, that can do whatever they want. They can wave their hand and drop the bombs. And so finding a way to live in a system of morality that will put some sort of personal checks on that, as opposed to maybe social checks. This is maybe the limits of what Bataille is talking about. He's not a political thinker larger than that. He's not proposing a model of statehood, because the state is the problem for him. Anytime that we have that sort of orderliness at that scale, he's going to want to talk about direct participation and people talking to their neighbors more. So reorganizing our experience of community. Right now we have virtual communities, which can sometimes do it, but that don't really bring us into this tragic sense of encounter that sets limits on our shame, the limit of shame.
One of the sort of implicit ideas that I see here, and this is just something that I'm teasing out too, is that I see a kind of conflict between, let's say, a kind of horizontalist anarchism versus maybe what Bataille's putting forward, which is, look, we have to acknowledge at some level that there is leadership. There's going to be differences and articulations of, strange attractors, if you will, and folks will organize around that. But part of our pedagogy of leadership involves a very radical sort of kenotic, an inculcation of this value of kenosis or kenotic living, where at some point the leader needs to realize the limits of their leadership, or just understand that, every political situation is tentative or metastable in some sense. Yeah. And there needs to be some sort of principle by which a leader knows it's time to give up their power. And this is something that needs to spread across groups, assemblages, societies, if you will.
Absolutely. I mean, I think Wendell Berry, of all people, I'm a great reader of Wendell Berry, but his emphasis on local culture and sort of the setting wide margins for failure and moving cautiously, but that sort of viral localism, that's very Bataillean. That's how Bataille thinks about groups. But yeah, I mean, as you say, I think absolutely this is what Bataille would say, that anytime that a leader clings to power, they've gone to the dark side.
Great. Well, why don't we finish up this way? I was going to ask you about Bataille's relationship to his father and war as a mother. And the reason I bring it up is I saw it in Guilty. I think there was I don't have the book in front of me right now, unfortunately, but I saw some reference maybe that you made in the introduction to his father, or maybe even Bataille makes it in Guilty somewhere. How are we to sort of square Bataille's larger project with whatever happened with his father? When you read the Surya biography, you don't get a very complete sense of what happened there. His father was an invalid, if I'm not mistaken, was completely blind, was immobile, and that had a deep impact on Bataille. And it doesn't seem like it was on the page, but I don't know if there was an instance of abuse or a history there or something like that related to his father as well. What do we know about his relationship to his father and his mother vis-a-vis the kind of man that he became? And not to Oedipalize him.
Well, no, in fact, we must. That is important to do. And he does so in Guilty, particularly in the notes. So there's a lot to say about that. And it ties back to the Nietzsche quote that we looked at. 287, Joyful Science 287. What's the title of the aphorism? The pleasure in blindness.
There it is. Yeah.
If that's not an Oedipus reference, which is often the case in Nietzsche. But so what's the story? Bataille's father had syphilis. And by the time Bataille was the second of two children, by the time that Bataille himself is born, his father is becoming an invalid and he will eventually go blind. So he's confined to a chair, and Bataille writes about the trauma of that sort of experience, the powerlessness of his father and being in the dark, his father just sitting in a dark room. Because he's blind. He doesn't need to light to see. And so this for a child is difficult. Thinking about power, thinking about these kinds of things. So Bataille underwent psychoanalytic treatment of a unorthodox kind in the 1920s. He wrote some dreams out of that. And then he also, and we find this in the notes to Guilty, continued to have dreams that are related to those early circumstances. He talks about being in a cellar, which is a key word for him, the sous-sol or the underground. It becomes the Dostoevskian space. And there's a suggestion that he may have been abused by his father in some sort of a cellar. But, his father could not walk. So how could that have happened? It doesn't quite add up. So is this a screen memory? Is this some earlier memory before the father became an invalid? Just exactly, we don't really know. Nevertheless, in Guilty, he's ruminating on he ruminates on his father. And when you read the notes to the edition of Guilty, you're reading the original notebooks. What he did to create the book after publishing Inner Experience was go back to those notebooks and edit whole buckets of stuff out of it. And that's another entire story. But when you're reading the notes, you can see him thinking about Colette Peno and her death and his father and his death. He compares Colette Peno and the father both to Oedipus. So he talks about his father's beak-like nose, basically the emaciated features of the older man. And he compares Colette on her deathbed to this older man. So it's an extremely tangled and rich psychological landscape in which he abandoned his father. That's the word that he consistently uses, right? World War I is underway. Bataille and his mother flee the invading Germans. They abandon the father. And that's the thing that Bataille will have this sense of abandonment that he evokes over and over again throughout his life. Whenever he separates from a group or people or something, he says that he is abandoned. Kuno abandoned him. He was the first to abandon me. The people in Acéphalous abandoned me. Just like the way that he abandoned his father. To be abandoned is to be without God. So there's a rich territory within all of that. He's abandoned by Colette Peno. in this sort of context. So all of those things are part of what you're talking about, this sense of abandonment, where he abandoned his father and then was in turn abandoned. That is behind those early pages of Guilty. This blindness, the blindness of Oedipus, is blindness to the future. That's the blindness of the madman wandering in Nietzsche. We don't know. The death of God means that we don't know what the future holds. That's our ignorance toward the future. It's our blindness towards it. And so all of that is spinning around in the background of Bataille's thinking in these periods. But as I say, if you read, as you were reading before, the Bruce Boone translation of Guilty, which does not include the notes, then you don't get any of that background. You get a marvelous book and a great translation of it, but the notes have this extra layer of texture that shows what else he's ruminating about. As he thinks about his past, he's trying to get rid of his past, but he also, is struggling with the thought of the future and all those kinds of things.
Class starts on Wednesday, so people are going to be getting a heavy dose this month. And we look forward to it. Like I said, I might be in the seminar depending on how many students end up filling it out. What can students expect for, let's say, the next 4 lectures that you're going to provide over March and the beginning of April?
Yeah. So the class should be really fun. The first week, we're going to be talking about, the first week will be a sort of general introduction to Bataille. I'd like people to read the first, part 1 of The Accursed Share, as well as that short essay, Economy at the Measure of the Universe. And so we'll talk about what general economy is. We'll talk about Bataille's cosmology. We'll talk about these things sort of in general terms, but I'll also spend time talking about problems in reading Bataille, in Bataille's life as it relates to his work, just sort of situating Bataille and also my approach to Bataille, which is, probably pretty clear from what we've been doing now. But also maybe it's not exactly philosophy, it's not exactly history. So how am I reading Bataille and how will we be reading Bataille in the class? That's the first week. The second week is going to talk about Bataille's formalistic aesthetic and the problem of base materialism. So what is materialism and what is base materialism, and how can we learn to think about things through this concept of base materialism? So we're going to be reading passages from some of the early writings and stuff from documents, but really trying to focus in on this problem of base matter. The third week will be about Bataille's social thought, so headless politics. Acéphale will be a central figure, but these problems of community that we were talking about, just exactly what sort of community did Bataille imagine? What were the roadblocks to that? What are the psychological problems with that? So headless community, formless community really, is going to be week 3. And then finally, week 4 is going to pull out into all the good stuff: laughter, eroticism, excess, intoxication, all of Bataille's methods of meditation, the things that he used to exacerbate his instabilities, all those ways out of the problem. So that's going to be the first part of what we're trying to do. But then we'll take a week break. And then for those folks who would like to continue, we'll be doing a seminar. And if I've been talking too much in the first 4 weeks, naturally I want to invite other people to ask questions and engage. But if the first 4 weeks are mostly me spinning my Bataille, the second set, the seminar, is inviting other people to share their thoughts on Bataille. So each week we'll have, a couple of presenters putting some interpretations out for group response. And that's going to be a smaller group so that we can get to know each other better and take some time to dig into those interpretations. And a couple of people have written to me about this, asking what they can write on. And, the answer is anything. So I'm broadly familiar with Bataille's work and also its use in the interpretation of contemporary culture. And that's the rough guide to it. But, if the there are no limits to whatever interests you that you think would be helpful to talk about in a kind of Bataillean context is going to be the goal. So my plan will be to help people think more clearly about Bataille and about their own work. And we'll do that for 4 weeks.
Yeah, and there are a few seats left in that seminar. And this is something that we've recruited Stuart for. He's helping us build the Acid Horizon Research Commons. But for the seminar, this is something that we've done as a gift to our subscribers. Acid Horizon is not taking any money in for this. This is a chance for you to sit with Stuart, him to offer his time and work with you folks. And we're very excited to have you. Adam, before we close out, do you have anything else?
I don't really, other than sign up for the seminar. If you want to, if you want to pick up the essay that we read for this, you do have the Acéphalous Compendium. Of course, we have a huge backlog of episodes with Stuart as well. And this has just been a fantastic conversation, to be honest, in terms of getting into the temporal stuff. The moment is often, something that it's hard to focus on, even for Bataille himself. And I really think we made a lot of headway in understanding how it connects to the whole global project, or say cosmic project of what he's trying to do here.